right, so I think we're right at about time right now to start. If you're still coming in, there's a few seats up here in the front, and it looks like there might be a couple over on the front here. But welcome. So you're here to talk about Canary deploys. So let's talk about deployments, right? What could possibly go wrong? And the answer is obviously a lot. How many people have experienced a deployment failure within the past week? Yeah. Painful. Hopefully none of you are on call right now, and hopefully that doesn't happen right now. But I love this meme, right? When I deploy to, or when I do blank, I do it in production, the most interesting man in the world. And we can fill this in with everything from, just crazy stuff that happens when we're doing operations or when we're doing software development. But the problem that we have is this. When I deploy to prod, I do it in production, right? As much as we would like to match our staging environments, our development environments, whatever we have to production, at the end of the day, you can only do so many dry runs, and things just get missed. So when you deploy to production, it obviously happens in real life, and there's no way to get around that. So I think that's why most of us are here, and we want to talk about Canary deploys. Before we do that, a little bit about me quickly. I'm Jason. I work as a technical evangelist at Datadog. I call that doing docs and talks. So I write technical documentation, which often requires me to read through our source code to understand what's going on. And then I come to events like this, and I speak, and I try to share my knowledge and the knowledge that we've gathered as an organization. I'm also a nomad, so I travel around. I don't live anywhere except for out of my suitcase. So if you like to travel, come talk to me about that later. I also love whiskey, and I play a lot of Pokemon Go, so if you see me wandering around later and I look lost, I'm not lost. I'm probably just trying to find a Pokemon. That said, Datadog, as I mentioned, is my employer. Datadog is a SaaS-based monitoring platform. We do infrastructure application metrics. We do tracing. We now do logs. We just try to make it easier for you to monitor your systems. To give you an idea of the scale of what we handle, we do trillions of data points every single day, hundreds of millions of data points every second. And we are hiring. So if you're looking for new challenges, interesting work that you want to do, if you want to help other engineers monitor their systems, we are hiring. And one caveat about this. So we are, just like many of you, moving to Kubernetes. We are exploring Istio. We haven't rolled it out across everything that we've got, so we are in the same boat as a lot of you in migrations. The other thing that I should mention with Istio is this fantastic quote from Kelsey that he made in February, that Istio is fantastic. I mean, if you're like me, you heard about it and you're like, I've got to try this thing out, and you went and you played with it. Don't run out of here and just throw it in production. Obviously, we want everybody to try to use Istio, play with it, explore it. There's no other way that we're going to get feedback and have the community keep contributing to it. But if you just throw it in production, bad things will happen. It's still alpha and very new. So how are we doing deployments today? How many people are doing blue-green deployments? OK, fair number of people. I'm assuming that all of you understand what blue-green is, but if you don't, it's really simple idea. You've got a load balancer that sits out front, points to version 1 or blue of whatever your application is, and it's pretty simple. You just make a switch, right? We do this on load balancers. We can do this in software. This is essentially a software version. We can think of things like Capistrano, where you're just really just directing a symlink to new code. And so this is traditionally the way that a lot of us have done software deployments. And obviously, the pros of this are that hopefully it's zero or near zero downtime, right? It's a configuration change. You're just redirecting traffic. Not too hard. And then you get easy rollbacks, right? The idea that if something goes wrong, you just flip that switch back. It's like just running an undo. How many people, though, have had this experience, right? When I say easy rollbacks, I should say easy rollbacks. Because we've all experienced this. When we do blue-green, you flip a switch, and whether that's in code or whether that's with your infrastructure, there's some change that's made that isn't reversible. Whether that's things like updating tables in a database, and suddenly you try to flip back and your data's all screwed up, things like that. How many people are doing rolling deploys? We are at KubeCon. So this is the way that Kubernetes by default does deployments. Pretty easy to understand. Similarly, you've got load balancer. In this case, Kubernetes sits out front. You've got a bunch of software, and essentially it rolls down one container, puts up the new one, and you keep running through this until suddenly everything's switched over. And this is great. Again, very little downtime. And one of the nice things is that because you're maintaining both sets of software, ideally, the rollbacks are easier, right? Because you hopefully have designed your software to be able to accommodate both versions. So what does Canary deploys do for us? Like, what's the main difference? Well, it really is this, right? We understand that what's your audience look like? I'm prone to saying really, really stupid things. And as my job is to get up on stage and say these things, I occasionally say stupid things on stage. And if you're like me, well, would I rather have it in a room like this full of people when I say something stupid, or in front of just maybe one person? So that's the idea of Canary deploys. It looks really similar to rolling deploys. So you flip over one, but the main difference is we stop. Stop and monitor whatever's going on. And then you continue on, and maybe you double check. And then you keep going, maybe just one more time, and then at the end, you party. So Canary deploys, again, the benefits are, you get a lot of the similar benefits of rolling deploys, but really, the bigger benefits that you have now are you have a small scope, right? You're only deploying to limited people, and that means your ramifications are much more constrained. Easier rollbacks, again, this also happens with rolling deploys. One of the other things that a lot of people miss out on Canary is because of the way they do it, and I'll talk about strategies a little later, but there's a lot of ability to become more load tolerant. If you monitor the right things, if you see more resource usage with your canaries, you have that time to scale up if that's something you want. And then concurrency. Concurrency is another thing that I think a lot of people miss with canaries, is you can start to essentially run your software teams in parallel and start to work on various things at the same time. So what does any of this have to do with Kubernetes? Well, a lot of people think of Kubernetes as a container orchestrator, right? When we talk about rolling deploys, and I had that diagram, you're thinking, okay, these are my containers. Kubernetes is actually a service orchestrator, and we have to start thinking of things in terms of services. Or maybe it's a Squirtle's orchestrator. If you want a sticker, I've got some. Hit me up later. But when we talk about deployments, like if we're thinking in terms of blue-green, for those that are still doing that, it doesn't really make sense if we're thinking in terms of services, right? Because you don't want to mirror your entire service architecture, right? This doesn't make sense. So the reason that this is great with Kubernetes is obviously Kubernetes manages all your services. So if you want to do deployments of a single service, well, it can do that. You can just swap in for single services or multi-services. So why do you need a service mesh then, right? What does this have to do? Well, Kubernetes is fantastic at rolling deploys, right? We all know this if you've ever done any sort of upgrades with Kubernetes, but not so much with Canary deploys, right? So if you've ever tried to do a Canary deploy with Kubernetes, it's a little tricky because it doesn't have that notion really of pausing and waiting on a rolling deploy. You can pause a rolling deploy, but it happens quickly. So you're not going to be sitting at your keyboard and telling Kubernetes to update and then quickly pausing it and then monitoring and then trying to do that, right? That's silly. So the nice thing about service meshes like Istio is they really provide us that control with routing and load balancing. And that really is the crux of what Canary deploys is. But more than that, they provide a bunch of other great features. Service discovery is another one, because obviously if we're doing routing, we want to know where we're routing things to. Timeouts and retries, so we want to ensure that we can retry when things fail, that we can have some circuit breaking, that we can have a lot more control over what's going on. Policy enforcement. How many of you have developers out there that are just using standard things like the equivalent of curl within their code, and they're reaching out or exposing unencrypted endpoints? Nice thing about Istio is you can enforce that to be TLS. And then monitoring and tracing. Obviously, if all of our traffic is running through our service mesh, it gives us a really great spot that we can actually monitor all of that. So how's this done? You start with basic Kubernetes. You have all of your workloads. You push them aside. You sidecar. This is what's called the data plane. And this is actually Envoy. So I know that we've been talking a lot about Istio, and I know a lot of sessions have been talking about Istio. Under the hood for that data plane, it really is Envoy. So that's how that happens. And then we have the control plane, and this is really the guts of Istio. So let's talk a little bit about Istio. The main portion of Istio that I think all of us are interested in, because it's where all the logic happens, is the mixer. And the mixer provides us with really three main things that it does. And the first is precondition checking, so essentially access control. The second is quota management, and that's essentially rate limiting. So we can say, for example, the service can only receive 5,000 requests per second. So it gives us control over that. And then, as mentioned, there's a lot of telemetry reporting because it's really easy to get that data. With the mixer, you have adapters. Currently, the adapters that exist for the precondition checking, it's really, these are the ones that exist right now. The denier, which is just say no. It's like your mom, I guess, telling you not to do things. There's lists, so you can whitelist and blacklist things. There's the open policy agent. I think I saw someone down here wearing the OPA shirt, which is awesome. I love that logo. And then there's RBAC. For the quota management, there's really only two right now, which is interesting. There's the in-memory quota management, which is the default, and then there's the Redis-backed one. So just essentially two places that you can store those. And as I mentioned, telemetry is huge. So Istio started with Prometheus, obviously, and there was statsd. They've added dog-statsd, which is what Datadog uses. They've added a ton of others. Essentially, whatever monitoring product you're using, there's probably an ability to get an adapter for it. There's probably one already there. But there are a bunch of them. You can view them within the GitHub repo. So that was a lot of time talking about the basics. And hopefully, I think we're in day 3 of KubeCon. I think most of that you should have known, hopefully. But let's talk a little bit about strategies, because I think this is the most important when it comes to doing Canary deploys with Istio. The Istio part is easy, and we'll cover that later, but the hard part is the strategies. So how many people are doing Canary deploys? Okay, just a few out there. Those people that are doing Canary deploys, if you're like a lot of organizations, most organizations that I talk to are doing Canary deploys pretty much at random, picking some percentage of traffic to go somewhere. And this is totally fine if we're talking about back-end services. But if you're talking about Canary deploying to your customers, to your end users, we all know that random, especially with computers, is generally not so great. It's often not very random. There are a lot of other things that we need to take into account. So when it comes to your Canary strategies, you really need to start thinking of how they can be representative. And when I say representative, you have to think of what your users are like. You can think of things like geography. If I'm rolling out a test to some of my users, well, if I'm rolling it out in the middle of the day, am I thinking of my users that are currently in the same country, in the same region that I'm in? Or if I'm a global company, I have to take into account, what are my users in Japan? How do they use my product versus my users here in Denmark? So that's one thing to consider. The next is time. Canary deploys are great because you can deploy and then you can monitor, but if you're deploying at a time when a lot of your users aren't actually using your product, how does that affect your Canary deploys? Are you getting misinformation based off of that? And then you have to think about usage patterns as well. So what times do your users typically use your product? How do they use it? In what ways? The other thing that you have to consider when you're doing a Canary deploy is the granularity. So a lot of people, again, if they're doing just a percentage, that's easy to scale up, right? You can say, let's start with deploying to 5% of my users, and then go up to 10% and continue building up. But if we're thinking of being representative, if we're thinking of how are my end users using this product, what do I actually want to measure, then how do you do the granularity? So there are some interesting ways that you can think about this. For example, Grubhub, which is one of our customers, they Canary deploy to small cities first. So that's their granularity. They'll deploy to a small city, measure that, deploy to a larger city or to a province, deploy to countries, deploy globally. So think about how you're going to scale your Canary sets. And then the final one is resource mapping. And I think this is really particularly interesting because if you're canarying a particular service, think about how that maps to your backend resources. What servers does that impact? What data stores does that impact? And as mentioned before, the great thing about using canaries is that you can now start to scale. So if you roll something out and you see that it's hammering a database, that may not be a good thing, but potentially, if it's a significant change, a small increase in access to a data store might be okay. And so you can start to accommodate for that, right, as you see that metrics start to spike up or trend upward. So let's talk a little bit about what your monitoring strategy should be, right? The whole point about canaries is to deploy a little and monitor it. So the first thing that we absolutely need, is tags, or if you're using Prometheus, using labels. You have to understand where your data is coming from, what it actually means. So if you think of a data point or a metric as a thing and a number and when it happened, well, that's great, but you'll never be able to find that data unless you actually tag it or label it, especially if you're starting to do concurrent Canary deploys. The next thing that we need to monitor is starting to look at those extremes. As we deploy smaller pieces, if we're looking only at the P90, the 90th percentile, we're going to miss a lot. If you're looking at the P95, depending on your Canary size, you're also going to miss a lot. So start to think about pushing out. What's your P99 look like? Because that single user or that handful of users that are experiencing problems with your Canary deploy, as you continue to roll out, that grows really rapidly. Start thinking about outliers. Outliers, I like to say, is one of these things is not like the other. It's pretty understandable, right? If we're thinking of Canary deploys, what does my Canary deploy look like versus my production? Really simple. So if your monitoring tool has outlier detection, make use of that. The other is anomalies. So the difference between outliers and anomalies, outliers is one of these things doesn't look like the other. Anomalies is this thing doesn't look like it has in the past. So enable anomaly detection if your monitoring tool has it. There are also open source projects out there that will help with this. But as we think of trends, and as we think of looking at small Canary sets, noticing the differences can be hard. So make use of machine learning, make use of anomaly detection, algorithmic alerting, things like that. So what signals should we watch? I particularly like the 4 golden signals from the Google SRE book. I think they really match when it comes to Canary deploys. And the first is that you should look for changes in latency. Right? This is pretty obvious. If you're making a Canary deploy and suddenly things are slower for those people, that's going to be a problem. So monitor for that latency. The next of the signals is errors. And so a lot of people, when they think of errors, they're looking at error rates. One thing, though, that I find particularly helpful is not to look at the error rates, but look at the types of errors. When you're rolling out new code, you might get errors, but they'll often not be the same errors that you saw before, right? Because you're doing new things. So check for different errors. You may not see a spike in the number of errors, but you may be seeing differences in the errors that you're receiving. Traffic is obviously important when you're looking at representative Canary sets. How are your changes in traffic handled, or are there changes? So monitor for that. And then finally, saturation. And again, this comes back to thinking of when you're setting a Canary deploy and you're rolling that out and it's representative, how does that map back to your resources? So let's talk a little bit about Istio. Let's jump into it. Installing Istio, if you haven't done it, because there weren't a lot of hands when I said, or when I was asking about that, but download it, unpack it, add it to your path, and really just apply it. So what's this actually do? Well, when you apply it, it sets up a few things, and the first is Istio Pilot. Istio Pilot is essentially what handles the Envoy API. It's also the interface between your platform, between Kubernetes and Istio. The next, as we mentioned before, is Istio Mixer. It's the part that handles all the logic that's really interesting. And then the last part is Istio Ingress. And Ingress is, as you would think, it handles all of the inbound traffic. So how do you actually run this? Well, really, really simple. We're all familiar with kubectl, kubectl, kubecontrol, however you like to say it. Really, you just pass your YAML files through the Istio CTL, and it injects things. And then it just like magically does its thing, right? I also often compare this to when people tell you to just like curl and pipe that to bash and just like trust me. So what's it actually do? Well, it is pretty benign. It adds really this. I mean, it adds a bunch of other stuff that Istio needs, but when it boils down to it, this is what it actually does. And it's really just adding an init container to run that sidecar for Envoy. The cool thing, though, that I'm pretty excited about is auto sidecar injection. And this is fairly new. So it starts with mutating webhook controllers. So mutating webhook admission controllers, what that really does is it sits in between the authentication for Kubernetes and before that object is persisted. It allows things to modify what goes into Kubernetes. So the cool thing is when this happens, if you actually make use of this, all you have to do is to label your Kubernetes or your deployments, and it'll look for that label and then automatically modify things and add Istio into there, or essentially add that Envoy sidecar. So this is beta with Kubernetes 1.9 is when this came out. So it's still being worked on, but it's actually surprisingly fairly stable from what I've been using it for and just playing around with it. So Canary deploying with Istio, how's this done? Well, you start off with a service. The service doesn't actually get changed. This is all standard Kubernetes. The deployments, so you set up 2 deployments, right? And there's not a whole lot. You just have to create version 1, version 2. This is actually how you would do Canary deploys with straight up Kubernetes. The only difference is if you're trying to do this with standard Kubernetes and Canary deploy, well, you would have to manage both of these, right? And you would set your replicas, and you would just have to manually say that I want 10 replicas of version 1 and 1 of version 2, and then you'd have to manually tweak that down to 9 and 3, or constantly shift that. So that's annoying, and that's what's great about Istio, because with Istio, you have route rules, and makes it easy. So you start off with 1 route rule, sends 100% of your traffic to version 1, and it really is that easy. Adding another route rule, sending a percentage of traffic to version 2. The other really cool thing about Istio, though, is, as mentioned, you don't want Canary deploys to just be a percentage. So you can do really cool things with Istio, like having more complex route rules. Set a header. There are great libraries out there to detect where your users are, where they are from their browser. Set a header for that. Start redirecting your users based on geography, or based on IP, based on loads of other things. So what else can Istio do? It can do a ton of stuff. Really, as mentioned before, get out there and play with it. So that's the link to the docs. Go play with it. See what you can do. So just a quick recap. Service meshes, why do you want them? Well, they give you more control, particularly when it comes to Canary deploys. So when you're doing your Canary deploys, as you're getting that control, think about how you can be more representative with your users, how you select that Canary deploy set. When it comes to the monitoring, and the monitoring is the hardest part of Canary deployments, really, is to figure out how you're going to monitor things and start with those tags or those labels if you're using Prometheus. Then think about those outliers and anomalies. So find those tools that will get you that algorithmic detection or that machine learning detection. And then finally, what to watch for. Take a look at that latency. Take a look at the types of errors that you're receiving, the traffic that you're seeing, and the saturation behind those resources. All that said, it is May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. And I'll do some questions. And as I do that, so I've been told use the mics, or if you can't get to a mic because it's pretty full in here, yell it out and I'll repeat it. And for those of you that were taking photos of the slides, there's the link to download them. Thanks.